Think about the people you feel genuinely closest to in your life. Chances are at least a few of those bonds didn't form during a vacation, a party, or an easy, comfortable stretch of time. They formed during something hard, a stressful project that nearly fell apart, a family crisis, a period where everything felt uncertain, and you happened to go through it next to someone else. This isn't a coincidence, and it isn't simply because difficult experiences are more memorable. There's a specific psychological mechanism that makes shared adversity create faster, deeper, and often more durable bonds than shared enjoyment ever does. And understanding it explains something most people have noticed about their closest relationships without ever knowing why. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why difficulty bonds people more effectively than fun, what's actually happening neurologically when this occurs, and how to use this mechanism deliberately to build genuine connection, without needing to wait for an actual crisis to do it. Stay until the end, because the last part explains why some of the closest relationships from hard periods quietly fade once the difficulty ends, and what that reveals. Let's start with the foundational mechanism, because it's more specific than simply shared experiences create bonds. When people go through stress or adversity together, their bodies release oxytocin, a neuropeptide closely associated with trust, attachment, and social bonding. While oxytocin is often discussed in the context of positive experiences like physical affection, research shows it's released even more reliably under conditions of shared stress, specifically because oxytocin appears to function, in part, as a biological mechanism for increasing social cohesion precisely when a group most needs to cooperate to survive a difficult situation. This means difficulty doesn't just happen to occur alongside bonding. It actively triggers a stronger neurochemical bonding response than comfortable, low-stakes situations typically do. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes clear sense. Ancestors who bonded quickly and strongly with others during dangerous or difficult periods were more likely to receive cooperation, support, and protection when they needed it most. The biological reward for bonding under adversity was survival itself, which is precisely why the mechanism remains so powerful today, even in contexts with far lower actual stakes. There's a second mechanism layered on top of the neurochemical one, and it's arguably even more important for understanding why these bonds feel different in quality, not just intensity: involuntary vulnerability. In comfortable, low-stress social situations, the version of yourself that other people see is largely curated. You choose what to share, how to present yourself, which parts of your internal experience to reveal. This isn't dishonest. It's simply how ordinary social interaction works. But it does mean that bonds formed exclusively in comfortable circumstances are often built on a managed, somewhat filtered version of each person involved. Difficulty removes much of that filtering, often without anyone choosing it to happen. Under genuine stress, people don't have the same capacity to maintain a fully curated presentation. Fear shows, exhaustion shows, frustration, doubt, and real vulnerability surface, not because anyone decided to be more open, but because the cognitive and emotional resources normally used to manage self-presentation are being consumed by the difficulty itself. What other people witness during that period isn't a chosen, edited version of you. It's something closer to an accurate one. And being seen accurately, even unintentionally, tends to create a deeper sense of being truly known than being seen in a carefully managed, comfortable context ever does. Qualitatively different from bonds formed during enjoyable shared experiences, even when the enjoyable experiences happen far more frequently. A person you've shared dozens of pleasant, easy interactions with may still feel less deeply known to you than someone you went through one genuinely difficult week alongside, because the difficult week generated actual data about how that person behaves under real pressure, what they prioritize when resources are scarce, and whether they remain present when things stop being easy. Comfortable interactions rarely generate that kind of information, no matter how many times they're repeated. There's a third factor worth naming specifically, because it explains why some adversity-bonded relationships feel intensely close while they last, but then fade rapidly once the difficulty resolves. Context-dependent bonding. Some of the closeness generated by shared adversity is genuinely about the people involved, real, accurate mutual recognition that persists afterward. But some of it is generated by the situation itself, specifically by the heightened emotional state and the practical interdependence that the adversity created. Once the adversity ends and that interdependence is no longer necessary, the situational component of the bond can dissolve relatively quickly, leaving people who shared something genuinely intense during a crisis surprised to find the relationship cooling once ordinary life resumes. This isn't a sign that the original connection was fake. It's a sign that adversity bonding has two separate components, one based on accurate mutual recognition, which tends to be durable, and one based on situational intensity and necessary cooperation, which tends to be temporary. Distinguishing between these two components after the fact explains why some crisis-formed friendships become lifelong, while others quietly disappear once the shared difficulty is no longer present to sustain them. So if shared adversity is such a powerful bonding mechanism, does that mean meaningful connection requires waiting for an actual crisis? Not necessarily. And this is where the mechanism becomes genuinely useful rather than simply explanatory. What adversity actually provides isn't difficulty itself. It's involuntary vulnerability and accurate mutual witnessing under conditions where curated self-presentation becomes difficult to maintain. Those specific conditions can be deliberately approximated at much lower stakes without needing an actual crisis to occur. First, seek shared experiences with genuine difficulty embedded in them, even at low stakes. Physically demanding activities, complex collaborative projects with real deadlines, situations involving authentic uncertainty rather than fully controlled comfort. The difficulty doesn't need to be dramatic. It needs to be real enough that managing a fully curated self-presentation becomes genuinely harder than simply being present and honest. Second, deliberately reduce self-presentation management in ordinary interactions, rather than waiting for circumstances to force it. Sharing an actual current struggle, an honest uncertainty, or a real difficulty you're facing, instead of defaulting to the curated, comfortable version of an update, creates some of the same involuntary vulnerability that adversity generates naturally, without requiring an actual crisis to occur first. Third, when you do go through genuine difficulty with someone, pay deliberate attention afterward to which parts of the connection were about who they actually are versus which parts were primarily situational. This distinction helps you invest appropriately going forward, continuing to nurture the parts based on real recognition, while not being confused or hurt when the purely situational intensity naturally fades once the original difficulty resolves. Fourth, recognize that comfortable, easy shared experiences aren't worthless for bonding. They're simply addressing a different layer of connection. Pleasant shared time builds familiarity, shared history, and accumulated positive association. Difficulty builds depth and accurate mutual knowledge. The strongest long-term relationships typically involve both comfortable time that sustains the relationship day to day, and at least some shared difficulty that has tested and confirmed what was actually true about each person involved. Here's what ties this together. The reason your closest bonds often trace back to hard times isn't sentimental coincidence. It's a measurable, specific psychological mechanism. Oxytocin release under shared stress, combined with involuntary vulnerability that strips away curated self-presentation and replaces it with something closer to accurate mutual recognition. Difficulty doesn't just happen alongside connection. It actively manufactures the precise conditions connection actually requires, conditions that comfort, however pleasant, rarely produces on its own. If this explained a relationship in your life, tell us in the comments about a bond that formed during a difficult period, and whether it lasted once the difficulty ended. And if you want to keep uncovering the hidden mechanics behind human connection, the next video is right there, waiting for you.